I just want to remind everybody that we are just, we're recording the top portion of this, which will be posted on our websites, but the Q&A we will not record with you bring this up to ask or comment in any way that you want. So welcome everybody. Today we're continuing, for those of you who are in the class, we're continuing our focus on the role of safety in shaping transportation systems and in shaping behavior. And today we're specifically focused around racial disparities in policing. So very excited to have Asiyahola Sankara here with us today to talk about this topic. Asiyahola is an Equal Justice Works Fellow who is housed at the ACLU of Southern California. He is a lawyer whose work focuses on transportation-related police practices that harm Black, Brown, and low-income people. And prior to his current role, he served as company manager of the Alliance for Community Transit, where he led work to reimagine sort of public safety on transit by steering funds away from policing and toward infrastructure investments and improvements. So please join me in welcoming Asiyahola here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you all and for the introduction. Really appreciate being here and getting a chance to talk to you all about this issue. I am, as mentioned, a legal fellow at ACLU Southern California. We are just coming out of celebrating our 100-year centennial. So we've been around for a minute, done a lot of work, including on issues related to transportation and transportation justice. So my focus today is going to be on policing and transportation-related police practices. But there's just, there's a lot that we could talk about even within that bucket of work. So the focus today is even within transportation-related police practice is going to focus mostly on police traffic stops. The first California legislature in 1849 defined vagrant as a person moving from place to place without any lawful purpose. And harsher penalties were established for people who were Indigenous, who were Latinx, who were Black, and people who were convicted of vagrancy were then often sentenced to hard labor building roads in various parts of the state. So that was, literally the first session of California's state legislature. So from the very outset, the system created to police movement has been deeply rooted in racist conceptions of what constitutes acceptable and unacceptable mobility for individuals, particularly people who are poor. And ACLU, all of our work is around striving for a democracy that is just, that is equal, and we believe in that democracy will only ever be just and equal when human rights are guaranteed for all, and when these systems of racism, of white supremacy, of injustices, including transportation injustices, are rolled back so that individuals can have rights that are never taken away. And today, we don't have to go all the way back to 40s and 50s, right? Travel on today's transportation systems are the most policed activity of everyday life. So like I said, we just celebrated our centennial last year at ACLU SoCal. We have a long history of impact litigation related to transportation justice, related to advancing transit justice goals. So for example, the Bus Riders Union case, ACLU SoCal, along with NAACP Legal Defense Fund, represented the Bus Riders Union Strategy Center in court, and BRU was able to win $2 billion in bus service restored, which was just a landmark case, right? And landmark organizing campaign in transit justice. ACLU SoCal was part of that. We're very proud of that. But we do more than litigation. Our theory of change is rooted in an integrated advocacy model. And the tools that we bring to bear include litigation, but also policy advocacy, media, coalition building, and activist engagement. And so what I'm going to focus on today is sharing some of the work of one of those coalitions that we do a great deal of policy advocacy work on this issue. The coalition's name is Push LA, and I'm going to be sharing with you some slides and a presentation really that we just developed and presented last week or the week before to LA City Council's Transportation Committee. We presented this information and presented our arguments for why the city of LA should replace armed police traffic stops with, they're called alternatives, but with care-based real safety, right? Things that actually measurably improve safety on our roads, reduce crashes, and eliminate the humiliating and often deadly encounters between police and people in our community. So these slides were developed and presented by myself, by two other individuals who also served on the Traffic Enforcement Alternatives Advisory Task Force that was established by LADOT to produce recommendations for a report on what LA traffic enforcement would look like if we remove police. So when we presented to LA City Council, we were presenting these recommendations, and so Catalyst California, Chauncey Smith from Catalyst California, and Leslie Cooper from Community Coalition also served on that task force and been doing a great deal of advocacy and leadership, providing leadership to the Push LA Coalition. So in terms of agenda, these are the things that we're gonna cover. Cool. Just some background and context setting. And then I'm going to share some of the recommendations to the city of LA that communities and this advisory body have developed over the course of years of what non-police traffic safety looks like. So those recommendations around ending pretext stops, limiting fines and fees, self-enforcing street design, and unarmed care-based response. So I'll just start with a little background on Push LA. Push stands for Promoting Unity, Safety, and Health in Los Angeles. And we were formed back in 2018, really in response to decades of racist policing, but also in response to an article from the LA Times that found that almost half of drivers stopped by the Metro Division of LAPD were Black motorists, almost half, while Black people make up only 9% of residents in the city. So this is just an enormous disparity. And the LA Times story confirmed what so many people in the community have been saying for decades and decades, right? That we are being stopped and harassed and humiliated. So lived experience with racist policing, it was confirmed by this article, and in response, Push LA, it's an inclusive cross-sector coalition of base building organizations, advocacy organizations, with deep experience and roots in the community. Push LA was formed to demand an immediate end to these racially biased LAPD stops. And that work accelerated following the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery in early 2020. Of course, there was a groundswell across the country and an uprising that brought millions of people into the streets who were also calling for an end to state violence against Black people and an end to anti-Black racism. And in the midst of all of that, a motion was introduced in LA City Council by a few council members that called for a study of alternative models of traffic safety that don't rely on police to meet traffic safety goals. And the motion was acknowledging the disproportionate impact of LAPD's racially biased policing, and And also shortly after it was introduced, in August 2020, Dijon Kizzy was pulled over while riding a bicycle in Westmont, and killed at the hands of police. So I, along with and thank you so much for the introduction that covers so much of my work. I've also been, for the last 10 years, a member of BLMLA. I was one of the first members when BLMLA was first founded in 2013, 2014. It was the first chapter of what ended up becoming the Black Lives Matter National Network. And as you know, I've stayed involved. I'm no longer an organizer with BLM, but I've stayed involved and in contact with the organizers who are also in Push LA. And something that has always been really important to BLM is just making people aware that this is real lives, right? So I'm going to be sharing a lot of data and facts, but also just want to root us in. I went through that. Forgot to click through my slides this whole time I was talking. Sorry, folks. Just going to jump around a little bit. Here we go. We're skipping ahead. But I just want to root us in, this is real for families who have loved ones, completely just their lives stolen from them, children left behind. This is a photo of Keenan Anderson, and another photo of Takar Smith. And Keenan was a beloved 30-year-old Black father. He was a brother, he was a fiance, he was a school teacher, a community member, and he was tased to death in the middle of a busy intersection by LAPD after a minor traffic collision. Takar Smith was a husband, he was a father of 6, he was a cousin and beloved family member in his community and community member. And we're hopeful that if we're successful in these efforts to create alternatives, to create strategies that don't involve police, that can bring other care-based models to bear on mental health crises and traffic enforcement, that we can bring an end to these stories, so that we no longer have to have memorials and candlelight vigils and marches and uprisings, that we can finally treat these histories as history, as something that belongs to the past. Let me just jump back and see if I missed anything vital in these slides. I did want to mention, these are the coalition members of Push LA. ACLU, Black Lives Matter, Brotherhood Crusade, Brother Sun Selves, Catalyst California, Children's Defense Fund, Community Coalition, Cheerla, LA Voice, Labor Community Strategy Center, $1 Million Hoods, which is based here in UCLA, SEIU Local 2015, SEIU Local 99, SCLC, and Social Justice Learning Institute. Went through this. I made all of these slides and then didn't present them to you all. Well, I'll continue the story here because I stopped where the motion had been introduced, right? And picking up where I left off, motion was actually passed by City Council February 2021, and Push LA organized a great deal of advocacy to move LADOT to make sure that the advisory task force that it was creating was reflective of the community, and was reflective of not just the community, right, but of the people in the community who've been building leadership around this for decades, people in the community who had been organizing those marches that brought millions into the streets, right? So that task force ended up being convened and met over the course of a year to develop recommendations that we're going to discuss, and a report that I'll make sure to provide you all with a link to in case you're interested in doing a deeper dive. And 2024, the work continues. The focus is on how do we implement these recommendations so that this is not just a really cool set of recommendations sitting on a shelf gathering dust. So first, I want to talk about pretext stops. What are they? Why are they problematic? What are the harms to communities of color? What has been LAPD's most recent policy related to these? and our proposed solution, or meaning Push LA, along with other jurisdictions. So what is a pretext stop? A pretext stop happens when an officer has a hunch based on often implicit biases that somebody has committed a crime. But that hunch alone is legally insufficient to justify stopping the person. So then, to stop the person, the officer identifies some minor non-safety related thing, a defective bumper, or, an air freshener hanging from the rear view mirror, and then uses that as the legal basis to stop somebody in their car. And also could do it on the street, on a bike, or whatever. The officer then subsequently investigates for evidence of a crime that's unrelated to the minor thing that the person has been stopped for. Why is this a problem? Enormous racial biases, as was confirmed, right, by multiple studies, LA Times reports, but also the lived experience of people in Black and brown communities in LA. But in terms of the data, the LADOT report includes a whole quantitative section. The development of that was led by Maddie Brosen here at UCLA as a consultant. And that report shows that for all LAPD stops that were measured during that time period, 2019 to 2021, Black people accounted for almost 27% of them, while making up just under 8% of the city population, while white people accounted for 17%, while making up about 28% of the population. About 75% of the stops were for traffic violations, and most were for like non-moving violations. So, administrative stuff and equipment violations, so expired licenses, expired registration, didn't get your smog check. These stops, they undermine safety, although they're described as advancing traffic safety and making the street safer. Traffic safety outcomes have grown worse year after year in LA. Last year, more people died in crashes than in homicides in the city, reaching like 20-year high for fatalities. And this is expected to continue if this strategy of making roads safer by stopping Black and brown people, for not having air fresheners hanging in their rearview mirror, like this is going to be the reality that continues if this strategy continues. The irony, the horror around all of this is that Black and Latinx people are actually less likely to possess contraband when stopped than white people. And so along with the racial bias and the fact that this undermines safety, it's also a waste of public dollars. It's extremely expensive to conduct these kind of just routine stops, routine operations. We're talking about billions of dollars in growth in LAPD's budget over time. And this is only getting worse over the years. The LAPD union just secured a huge package of raises that are already pushing the city into a major budget crisis, where other departments are now going to need to be defunded to pay for increased, retirement and pensions and all of this stuff. So the harms range from physical harms, as severe as killing somebody in their car, but also they're deeply humiliating. Humiliating not just for the drivers, but also for the people in the community who witnessed them and have to walk by knowing that that could be me, or that could be my brother or my sister or my family member. There's a whole range of body of research around the social costs of policing. Some of that's been done by the Vera Institute for Justice. They compiled all of these, much of it public health studies showing the impacts on depression and anxiety rates in young Black girls who have not been stopped themselves, but like witness stops or live in communities where their community members are often subjected to them. There's been studies showing that like voting rates decline. So there's a whole range of impacts to public health and other aspects of social life. And then of course there's fines and fees, and just overall a devaluation of life. So LAPD's policy around this And I'm gonna move through this actually pretty quickly because there's some other pieces that I want to cover. But LAPD's policy is pretty weak, right? As you can see, therefore, officers should make stops for minor equipment violations or other infractions only when the officer believes that such a violation or infraction significantly interferes with public safety. So it's permissive, right, rather than restrictive. Like if the officer believes, this, that, and the third, then they can make that stop. So it's a situation where the exception also swallows the rule, because if officers are acting on articulable information, in addition to whatever the traffic violation was, they're able to conduct the stop, even if there isn't reasonable suspicion regarding a serious crime. So the solution in the report, solution that Push LA supports, as well as the task force, is to completely and expressly preclude all stops for equipment violations, for non-moving violations, and for non-safety related moving violations. There are jurisdictions that have already moved to limit pretextual stops. This is something that we're seeing around the country, from North Carolina to Philly to San Francisco. There's a recognition around the country that we're not going to end serious and fatal crashes if our local and state governments continue to focus on these armed police stops as like the main way to create road safety. I also mentioned the fines and fees, right? So that's an aspect of police stops that is also a problem that the report looks at and has a proposed solution for. So why is this a problem? LAPD is obviously disproportionately stopping Angelenos in low-income communities of color for traffic violations. And often, people who are the most vulnerable can't afford to pay these costs. The fees, the penalties, they can explode from a base $100 fine, for a traffic violation to nearly $500. If somebody isn't able to make it to court, they can get a $300 civil assessment that could be imposed to increase the total to over $800. And this isn't even getting into the costs associated with like tows, right? And that, given that we live in a city where it is extremely difficult to, commute everywhere you need to go on public transit or by bike or foot, having a car is often a necessity. And so losing one's car can have this cascade of effects. Worked with a client last year who had several tickets that he wasn't able to pay, and it led to his car getting towed. He was unhoused. He was living in his car. He was diabetic, and the tow yard actually stole some of the medical equipment that was in his car when it was towed, because it was like very valuable. 2 sets of devices that each were like $300. He ended up going to the emergency room, and because he wasn't able to take care of his hands in the period where he didn't have his car. They were considering amputating because his hands were really infected. And it was just like this whole process started with what we're talking about right here, right? So again, these are real people's lives, real serious consequences. Even though sometimes we think of these fines or fees as like, oh, it's just like this much or that much, it's really small. Can have really enormous effects. And again, ineffective, right? So studies have shown that drivers, are, actually can't see that fact that I'm supposed to be quoting right now. Let me move the zoom. That drivers who receive a ticket for speeding are almost twice as likely to get another one as compared to drivers who have not. So in terms of the effect on like preventing dangerous driving behavior and just preventing crashes, there's better ways to do that we're going to get into in a second. And again, despite relying on punitive tickets along with police stops, traffic safety outcomes continue to worsen in the city of LA. So the proposed solution that we've put forward is to prevent this economic extraction by limiting tickets from being issued to low-income people, and creating solution-oriented economic assistance programs for non-safety related violations. So that could be done by using low income status, using the cost of living adjusted for poverty rather than the federal poverty level, so that more drivers are covered by these protections, having a presumption of low income in areas with higher concentrations of people living below the threshold, excuse the typo, and providing funding to subsidize administrative fee costs. And then in terms of equipment violations, similar, we could also have the city create vehicle repair clinics in neighborhoods in low-income areas, and just mail repair vouchers to drivers instead of conducting these tickets, these stops. Okay. So we're about at a half hour. I'm going to briefly cover this and actually move through some of the slides because you all are transportation planning students. You know a lot of this already. Some of this is we wanted to do basic education to the transportation committee. I'll just leave it at that. But this recommendation is around investing in self-enforcing infrastructure. What is that? That was just a working term that we created in the task force to describe infrastructure improvements that do not require enforcement of any kind in order to compel a driver to follow traffic laws. So one example that I heard from an LA DOT transportation planner was around that described this concept was around a bike lane. The city was designing a bike lane. They ended up installing it. And shortly after, they realized that they needed to coordinate with LAPD because drivers were driving into the bike lane. And so then the question was, oh my, like, how do we coordinate with LAPD to make sure that there's enough coverage around this intersection so that, you know, people who are going in and out are able to be like punished and caught to send a message to the others. So LADOT had this, or at least this planner had this moment of realization. We were considering a narrower bike lane that would have been too narrow for cars. If we had just gone with that option, we wouldn't be having any of this conversation around enforcement. The bike lane, the infrastructure would enforce itself because drivers would not physically be able to disobey this traffic law, right? So that's the concept. This isn't different than like complete streets, you know, or Vision Zero or safe systems approach, just framing it in a way that's a little bit more specific when it comes to the enforcement piece. And the task force and Push LA, in terms of how we think about infrastructure, you know, we think about it as shifting the focus away from how do we police individual behavior, how do we assign blame and punish people for making mistakes, how do we shift the focus to dangerous conditions and eliminate those conditions so that people aren't exposed to them. But again, you all are transportation, or excuse me, you all are urban planning students. So I think most of you, right? And some members of the public maybe. So I'm gonna skip this part for just in the interest of time. But yeah, this is like just general, punishment prevents prevention. That as long as the city is focused on changing behavior through enforcement, right? The city is not going to be able to reduce these serious crashes, and it's going to continue to use traffic safety as a pretext to conduct all of these racist stops in Black and brown communities. So the main recommendation here was to increase and prioritize self-enforcing infrastructure investments without increasing surveillance in high injury network corridors, low-income communities, and communities of color. And the proposed solution, how do we implement this recommendation? Twofold. One, Push LA and the task force are calling for the city to reprioritize investments in infrastructure, to fast track safety improvements in high injury network corridors through, perhaps a quick build improvements that prioritize infrastructure in low-income communities with a demonstrated need. Reducing the need for the police-based traffic enforcement. And a great first step would be for the city to adopt the capital infrastructure plan and actually have a plan for how it makes its investments in the public right of way. Secondarily, the city could create interdisciplinary crash investigation teams. So these could be cross-disciplinary teams that take over the role of investigating serious crashes as much as possible from the LAPD, And instead of focusing on how do we assign individual blame, who was at fault, investigating the crash with an eye for recommending improvements to the surrounding infrastructure that would prevent future crashes were they to occur. So, roadway design, improved traffic controls, vehicle design standards, like if the cars involved had been equipped with this already available technology, would it have prevented the crash? Those are questions that investigation teams like this could look into. And last but not least, before I pivot to just closing and starting the Q&A, the final recommendations were around unarmed care-based response. So in place of having armed officers, armed cops conduct the traffic stops, the report is recommending using unarmed police or unarmed civilians who are focused exclusively on road safety and not on criminal law enforcement to enforce safety-related traffic violations. So this was a point of contention, a point of difference between what was recommended by the task force in the report and what Push LA as a coalition wants to see. So Push LA's perspective is that, yes, it's important given the context of historic and continued police violence to remove armed police from traffic stops, but we don't believe that we want to replace one form of policing with another. To keep, to get rid of the armed stops and then keep this system of predatory fines and fees. The stops can be traumatic regardless of who is conducting them, whether or not they have a weapon. And also, again, it's something that could prevent prevention, right? Like, what is ultimately going to lead to safer streets in LA? Is it going to be a new fleet of LADOT civilians who are then stopping people for things? Or is it going to be the city, the state taking responsibility for eliminating the dangerous conditions that are leading to these deaths that are also disproportionately, the crash deaths disproportionately concentrated in Black and brown communities? And there's also some workforce concerns. I won't get into that in detail, but there's some hesitancy from LADOT who doesn't necessarily want to do that role, doesn't necessarily want to take it over. Also, anecdotally, there's been other situations where police or armed law enforcement has been replaced by then people who are tasked with enforcing the law, but then without the use of weapons. And for example, like probation officers, and there have been some questions around, does this actually encourage, in terms of the probation context, there have just been some issues that our coalition partners have experienced around that workforce then sort of compensating for the lack of weaponry by being more aggressive and just overall just being more disrespectful to the people that they're encountering. So this is, but again, this was a point of difference between the task force and Push LA coalition, and it will be interesting to see how this develops. The proposed solution in the report was for the creation of care-based teams. Some of this is already happening. So like crisis response workforce. So highly trained individuals who can respond to various crises, traffic related or otherwise, without weapons or law enforcement presence. This effort is actually moving forward in the city through the Office of Unarmed Response and Safety. And there are other city programs as well that have been digging into this question of, we don't need police to be responding to a whole range of things. Who are the civilian staff who could take over that role? So there's a lot of overlap, obviously, right, between the traffic conversation and those conversations. Would it necessarily need to be a whole different office of people if you're in your car and then somebody in the car next to you has a mental health crisis versus if that person was like in the Starbucks across the street, right? It doesn't need to be like a traffic, centered workforce. So those conversations are overlapping. So overall, those are the three, again, to recap, the three areas of recommendations that the report on non-police traffic safety alternatives put forward, that most of them being supported by Push, right? So ending pretext stops, investing in self-enforcing infrastructure, and creating care-based safety teams responsible for improving safety on the streets. That last one being sort of mixed in terms of its reception in communities in LA. What's next for this particular coalition? Like I said, implementation. So over the next 2 months, Push LA members are meeting with council members, with LADOT staff to propose motions, ordinances that, if passed by council, would begin to implement these report recommendations. And later today, I'm going to be meeting with Push LA. We have a meeting with LADOT's general manager to discuss this. So this work is moving along rapidly. And we expect to be seeing some council members introduce some motions around this in April that, hopefully will be, moving forward. You'll be able to see while you're still students here. I'll close out now and pivot to questions.